Have you ever heard the sound of your life collapsing just because of one sentence? I have, and that sentence did not come from a stranger. It came from my own son. Not a gunshot, not an accident, just 4 words, enough to crack my whole life like a fracture across a bridge beam. Sleep in the basement. In that moment, I understood a truth many people never dare to face. Family is not blood. Family is the people who don't push you into the dark when they have the chance to do so. If you have ever experienced the moment when the person you raised made your throat tighten, if you have ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize that silence became their excuse to step on you, if you know the feeling of standing in the house you built and no longer being seen as the owner of your own life, then this story is for you. Before we step into this journey full of cuts, I ask you for one small thing. Leave a single dot, and tell me where you're listening from, so I know that out there, someone understands this pain and still chooses to stay to see how the final light turns on. We begin. I always thought old age would arrive like a late afternoon in Maple Ridge, slow, warm, and smelling of damp pine mixed with sunlight. The 3-story wooden house I designed with my own hands over 10 years, every stone, every joint, every window frame, was the place I believed Marianne and I would grow old and peacefully. Yet that afternoon, peace was crushed in less than 2 minutes. I came home earlier than planned. The inspection site at the northern bridge shut down unexpectedly, so I drove the pickup through the forest and reached Maple Ridge 3 hours early. The sun was dropping behind the tall pines, the slanted light hitting the wood beams and turning the grain into a deep honey color. The color, I always joked with Marianne, was the light of our home. I opened the door and instantly knew something was wrong. Not because of voices. My house was quiet, so hearing people wasn't unusual, but because that voice didn't belong to anyone in my family. It was the voice of Stephen Hale, Darren's father-in-law, a man who always wore suits too bright for any occasion and spoke as if the world was unlucky for not revolving around him. He was talking loudly in the kitchen. I stepped lightly into the hallway, making sure no one knew I was home. "This part can be torn down," Stephen said, sounding excited, as if my house were a product, about to be dissected. "We break this wall, connect it to the master suite, make a Scandinavian double bathroom. Jenna will love it." I froze. Master suite. The main bedroom belongs to Marianne and me. Jenna spoke next, soft but sharp. "My in-laws sleeping in the basement makes sense. We need the master suite to be up to standard." I felt a cold sting run down my spine, a feeling 40 years on wind-beaten bridges had never caused. Darren, my only son, stood beside her, not objecting. He said one sentence, light as a breeze but sharp as a thorn. "Mom and Dad sleeping down there is tidy. No need to climb stairs. Jenna's family is used to a higher standard of living, so we need to adjust." I had to grip the doorframe to avoid stepping back, not because of the sentence, but because of the ease in his voice, as if pushing parents into a basement was normal in this house. Marianne stood in the corner of the kitchen. Her eyes widened like someone pulled out of a warm dream. Her lips trembled, her hand gripping the edge of her sweater until it turned white, as if letting go would release all her tears at once. I looked around the house, the smell of damp pine, the afternoon light through the tall windows, the wooden beams I had treated with linseed oil in the winter of 1998. Everything seemed to stare back at me, asking whether I had really heard those words. Then Darren saw me. He stiffened, but there was no shame. Only mild surprise, as if I appeared at the wrong time. "Dad, you're back early?" I wanted to ask 100 questions, but what came out of my mouth was only a short sentence, low and strangely calm. "I have no objection." Both Jenna and the Hale family looked surprised. Maybe they expected anger, an argument, a scene. But I did nothing. I only looked at Marianne. She avoided my eyes, but I saw her lips tremble. I walked to her and took her hand, so gently only she could feel it. "Let's go." That was all. No explanation, no raised voices. I took Marianne's hand and walked out of the house we had lived in for over 30 years. While behind us, Stephen was still talking about Italian marble, and Jenna was discussing curtain colors for the new house fan page. We walked down the stone path toward the car. The pine forest wind blew through, carrying the damp scent of earth. Marianne walked beside me, her hand ice cold. "Arthur, what is happening?" she asked, her voice close to breaking. I didn't answer right away. A bridge only collapses when there have been fractures for a long time. Maybe I hadn't noticed enough. When we reached the car, I opened the door for her, then walked to the driver's seat. I didn't speak until we had left Maple Ridge, driving through the winding forest road. We stopped at Four Peaks Lodge, the hotel with stone hallways and the faint scent of cedar. The receptionist recognized me immediately and bowed, but I only nodded and handed over the card. Marianne asked again, softer this time. "Arthur, what are we going to do now?" I stood by the large window, looking at the distant mountain range where sunset lit the early winter snow into a cold golden glow. The kind of light I always believed revealed truth without anyone raising their voice. I took out my phone. I didn't search for a number. I didn't hesitate. I just pressed a speed dial sequence I had set up years ago, but never thought I would have to use. When the person on the other end picked up, I didn't greet him. I only said 4 words, "Ben, activate the clause." And I knew from that moment my family would never be the same again. I used to think some truths were born to be kept away, not because they were dangerous, but because they could hurt the people we loved most. But that night, when the door of the Four Peaks hotel room closed, and the sound of wind rustling through the pine forest pressed against the large glass window, I knew it was time to open the box I had hidden for nearly 20 years. A box not made of wood, with no lock, but heavier than anything I had ever placed in my home storage. The secret about the estate that not even Marianne had ever known. She sat at the edge of the bed by the window, looking toward the Elk Range, fading into the purple light of the day's end. Her face was wrapped in warm yellow light, but her eyes were dark, as if trying to swallow a storm. "Arthur," she said, her voice low and thin like the first frost of winter, "tell me, what is happening? Why does Darren think he has the right to do this?" I pulled a chair closer, but didn't sit down. Some conversations require a man to stand, to keep balance between protecting and confessing. "Marianne," I said, "there is something I should have told you long ago." She turned to look at me, her eyes like a beam of light tilted by the wind. No accusation, only waiting, and that waiting made it harder to breathe than any blizzard I had ever driven through. I took a long breath. "There is a fund, a trust. It's called the Sloan Heritage Trust. I created it in 1999. She frowned slightly. "What trust? Why have I never—" "Since the day I sold the soundproofing material patent," I said slowly, measuring each word. "Back then I received over 16 million. I put 14 million into the trust. After more than 20 years, it has grown to 26.5 million. Marianne didn't breathe for a few seconds. I heard clearly the silence between us, a silence not soft, but sharp like the edge of a steel ruler. "Arthur, 26 million?" she nearly whispered, but each word fell to the floor with the weight of granite. I nodded. She leaned back slightly, her hands on her thighs for balance. It took her a few seconds to find her voice again. "Then, the house in Maple Ridge, also in the trust?" "Yes. It has belonged to the Sloan Heritage Trust since 2004. Not my personal asset and not our marital asset." Marianne stayed silent, but I didn't see anger in her eyes, which frightened me even more, because the silence of a wife who has walked nearly a whole life with you is the deepest kind of silence. I sat beside her. "I hid it because I wanted Darren to be independent. I tried to keep my voice steady. He grew up in a wooden house, eating simply, playing in the clearing behind the forest. He never knew his father had once been paid millions for a patent. I thought, if he knew, maybe he would never work properly. Marianne turned to me, looking directly at me for the first time since I began. But you didn't trust me? Her voice was gentle, without reproach, but that gentleness hurt more than any blame. I shook my head. It's not that I didn't trust you. I was afraid the weight of this secret would crush the family. I was afraid Darren would choose to live off the money instead of choosing to stand on his own. Marianne's shoulders dropped. She touched her forehead lightly as if brushing away a thick fog. Arthur, I don't need wealth. I don't need a trust. I just need our family not to break apart. But look, this very secret is breaking everything. My heart grew so heavy, it felt like my chest tightened. I reached out to hold her hand, but she stood up first and walked toward the window. Outside, snow was falling softly, landing shyly on the sill. Does Darren know about this? She asked with her back still turned. No, I answered. He never knew, until he tried to seize it himself. Marianne turned around, confusion flashing across her eyes. Seize it? I opened the document case on the table, took out a pepper-colored envelope, pushed it toward her. She opened it, pulling out each sheet. Copy of the request letter to Sparkstone Bank, seeking emergency guardianship. Applicant, Darren Sloan, accompanied by Stephen Hale. Reason, Arthur Sloan shows signs of diminished cognitive ability, requires financial supervision. I saw Marianne's hand tremble so hard the edge of the paper shook. My God, she breathed. He went with Stephen? He wanted you declared incompetent? I nodded. Ben blocked the file the moment the bank sent it over. They had no medical evidence, so it was denied. But the intention was clear. Marianne sat down, stunned. For the first time since meeting her in 1981, I saw her eyes filled with a sadness I didn't know how to name. Not sadness from loss, but sadness from realizing her son wasn't the person she thought he was. Arthur, why would he... She couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't answer, because if I did, I would speak from pain rather than truth. The air drifted for several minutes, heavy and dense like fresh snow on a roof. I opened my laptop, intending to email Ben that I had told Marianne everything, but as soon as I opened my inbox, a new email appeared from Ben Cross. Subject, about Darren's second submission. My hands went cold. I opened it, and in the very first line, I saw something that felt like a fist squeezing my chest. Arthur, I have found evidence Darren submitted another emergency guardianship request exactly 2 months ago. The witness signature belongs to Stephen Hale. I looked at Marianne. She looked at me. Neither of us spoke. But we both understood. Their plan A had never stopped. And this was only the beginning. I have walked across more suspension bridges in my life than I can remember. Some swaying over mountain gorges, some trembling under strong winds, some held up by cables so thin that being off by 0.5 millimeter could cost a life. But no bridge had ever made my heart tremble like the morning we went to see Attorney Benjamin Cross on the 37th floor of Union Tower. The building was so tall that the exterior glass reflected the entire Denver sky, and the hallway on that floor was quiet in the way places filled with more secrets than words often are. Ben greeted us with the familiar nod of a man accustomed to handling ugly things that good people never imagine. He was the kind of lawyer who only needed one glance to know who was lying, who was desperate, and who was trying to hide a crack big enough to collapse everything. Sit down, Ben said, then closed the glass door, making the city noise fade as if someone had emptied the air. On the table was a black file, neat, not thick, but I knew in law the thin and clean things are usually the most frightening. Ben opened the file. On top was the logo of Sparkstone Private Bank, the bank that had managed the Sloan Heritage Trust for over 20 years. He turned the first page, an emergency signatory request. Applicant, Darren Sloan, accompanied by Stephen Hale. Ben pushed the paper toward me. I looked at my son's signature, familiar like the handwriting of his childhood, yet never more distant. Under the Reasons section, the applicant expresses concern for noticeable cognitive decline in the truster, Arthur Sloan, suggesting an inability to manage long-term financial decisions. I read it again, slower. Then again. Cognitive decline. Inability to manage. I exhaled, my breath heavy like old timber groaning under fresh snow. Marianne sat beside me, her hand gripping her purse until her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak, but I could hear her breathing go uneven. They said you lost cognitive ability? She asked, her voice so tight it was barely a sound. Ben nodded. Yes, they tried to describe you as someone declining mentally, mixing up dates, forgetting schedules, losing control over finances. I let out a smile with no joy inside. I inspected a bridge last week. If I truly had declined, half of Denver would be rubble. Ben didn't laugh. He wasn't the type to laugh in the face of greed. He turned to the next page, explaining in a tone clear and cold as metal. Arthur, emergency guardianship is not a joke. It is a special procedure meant only for elders who truly lack capacity. Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, or documented medical evidence of decline. He tapped the file. But Darren and Stephen had no medical evidence. They only brought verbal claims. No doctor's form, no diagnosis, no neurological evaluation, nothing. I heard Marianne exhale like someone who had just avoided a truck, but Ben lifted his hand, telling us not to relax. They did not know, or pretended not to know, that in Colorado, a bank only needs one sign of bad intent to freeze the entire request and file a suspicion of financial exploitation report to Elder Protective Services. He slid another paper toward me, and let me be clear, their intent was more than enough. I leaned back. I had carried tons of concrete in my life, but one sentence from my lawyer made me feel as if I had carried a whole bridge pillar. They went to the bank to take the signing authority on my trust? Yes, Ben answered. If approved, Darren would have had the right to manage all $26.5 million, including the Maple Ridge house, the investment accounts, the shares, the fixed assets, and the distribution rights. I closed my eyes, partly from exhaustion, partly to keep Marianne from collapsing. But the bank denied it, I said, needing to hear it again. Yes, Ben confirmed. They denied it because the file was empty, and because you are clearly competent. He angled his head at me. But Arthur, what matters is not that they failed, but that they dared, I finished. Ben nodded. When Plan A fails, men like Stephen Hale do not quit. They move to the next plan. Simpler, less legal, but dirtier. I felt my body go cold. What is it? Ben looked straight at me. Taking the house, making you and Marianne lose your place by lowering your standing inside the very home owned by the trust. They couldn't get the money, so they targeted the roof over your heads. The air in the room shifted, heavier, thicker. I remembered Jenna's words the night before. The basement is fine for them. When paired with the file on the table, everything clicked like two dark puzzle pieces. Darren hadn't just gone along with Stephen and Jenna. He had calculated. Ben, I asked, what exactly was their plan? My lawyer didn't answer right away. He closed the file, placed both hands on the table, and spoke in a tone deep, sharp, and grieving for me. Their Plan A failed. Yesterday was Plan B, taking the house. I felt Marianne tighten her grip on my hand. Both of us understood. A child doesn't just wake up and want to push his parents into a basement. Only greed, or shame about where he came from, drives someone to strip his father of dignity. I looked at Ben. And Plan C? Ben replied without thinking. If you don't act, Plan C will be this, you being pushed out of your own life. And that was when I knew the battle had begun long ago. I was simply the last to realize it. After the meeting at Union Tower that morning, when Ben closed the file on the attempt to declare me mentally incompetent, we knew immediately. To stop Darren and the Hale family's Plan B, the only way was to make them write the evidence themselves. Not through words, not through messages, but through signatures. The one thing the law in any state in America treats as binding above all else. And so we built a trap as clean as glass, quiet as first snow, but sharp enough to sever every illusion held by people who believed they were smarter than the law. That afternoon, Ben sent a series of emails inviting Darren, Jenna, and the Hales to conference room 23B of Union Tower, with a harmless-sounding reason, discussing a transition method for managing the Maple Ridge home to make caring for the parents more convenient. I knew Darren would come immediately. He always thought he was chosen, that life owed him a place upstairs. And exactly as predicted, Jenna replied in 7 minutes. "We'll be there." Stephen Hale didn't reply, but I knew his type. The quieter he was, the more certain his presence became. Ben prepared everything carefully. Not a scam contract, not an obvious legal trap, just an extremely polite civil agreement, on paper titled Home Transition and Family Care Agreement. The first page read, Darren Sloan voluntarily agrees to support his parents as they age. For ease of transition, he will temporarily coordinate certain management activities of the home. It sounded like an act of filial duty, but Ben told me to look at line 12 on page 3, where 90% of people never bother to read. There, buried in a forest of small print, was the familiar legal sentence. The signing party, Darren Sloan, acknowledges that Mr. Arthur Sloan has shown signs of diminished ability to manage property and will receive decision-making support under this agreement. 63 words, one sentence. But if signed, Darren and the Hales would be admitting exactly what they did at the bank, creating evidence of elder fraud with their own hands, not turning it into a conviction by itself, but creating the perfect missing piece. That afternoon, conference room 23B was full of sunlight, the kind that streamed through the glass and fell across the walnut table, like someone was shining a spotlight onto every chair. It was the kind of light I liked, revealing. Darren arrived first. White dress shirt, too much hair gel, a face caught between nerves and confidence. Then Jenna, cream dress, sunglasses indoors. Finally, Stephen and Odessa Hale were walking in as if entering a board meeting rather than a family discussion. Jenna sat down and gave a polite, hollow smile. "I'm glad you two are finally cooperating. We just want things more orderly." I didn't answer. I simply nodded. Ben placed the documents on the table and opened the first page. "This is the agreement for Darren to help manage the home," he explained in a professional tone. "Mostly procedural, mainly to record each party's role in caring for Arthur and Mary Ann." They all lowered their heads to read. Page 1. Page 2. And then they stopped at the line Ben predicted. Jenna smiled lightly. "Oh, this is reasonable. Dad Arthur is older now, and he needs Darren to help manage the property. We agree with this part." Stephen nodded immediately. "Makes perfect sense. Sign it." Darren glanced at me, but only briefly. He wanted to appear responsible. He wanted to prove to his wife's family that he was a man of weight. And so he didn't read further. He signed, very quickly. A soft scraping sound as the pen moved across the paper. Then Jenna signed. Odessa signed. Stephen signed so hard that the pen left a groove through the paper. Ben gathered the stack, tapped it neatly on the table, and said, "Good. You've all confirmed something important?" Jenna tilted her head. "Confirmed what?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He simply lifted his gaze, and the sunlight flashing across the glass reflected in his eyes. 2 cold sparks. "All of you," Ben said slowly and clearly, "have just signed an official statement acknowledging that Arthur Sloan, who is alert, competent, healthy, and fully legally capable, cannot manage his property. The room was dead silent. I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside. Ben continued before they could form a thought. And that document, which you signed without reading carefully, will serve as supporting evidence in an elder fraud file. Jenna shot up from her chair. Wait, what do you mean? This is just an agreement about the house. No, Ben replied, his voice like steel. This is an admission. Darren went pale. Stephen leaned back, mouth open but wordless. Odessa pressed a hand to her chest, as if she'd lost her breath. And me? I simply sat there quietly, not pleased, not triumphant, just feeling something like justice, placing a hand on my shoulder and saying, They did this. You didn't have to. Ben closed the file, and with one final cold cut, all signatures are complete. This was no longer a trap. This was the truth they wrote with their own hands, and it was only the beginning. The 23B conference room sank into a kind of silence completely different from the silence when we first walked in. Earlier, the silence was the space before people made their move. Now the silence was the space after they had just stabbed themselves with their own trap. Darren stared at the file as if he looked long enough, the ink would fade on its own. Jenna squared her shoulders, trying to stay composed, but I clearly saw her collar tremble. Odessa looked like someone who had just missed a step on the stairs, and Stephen leaned back in his chair, hands clasped over his stomach, his face red more from anger than shame. You can't use that sentence to threaten us, Stephen growled. It's just a phrasing choice. What we meant was Arthur is older, needs support, not what? Ben cut in, his voice not raised but sharp enough that I could almost hear it slice the air. Not incapacitated, not unable to manage assets, but that is exactly the wording you signed. He tapped his finger on the small print line, a soft sound that echoed in the frozen room. In elder law, we call lines like this stakes. Once driven into the ground, they mark the boundary very clearly. From this moment forward, any attempt by you to access Arthur Sloane's assets can be considered financial exploitation. Jenna tried to smile. You're exaggerating. This is a family matter, not... Ben lifted his eyes to her. Family, he said slowly, is not a shield for abuse, especially when it touches a trust worth $26.5 million. The sentence landed like a stone thrown into a still lake. Darren jolted. 26.5 million? He turned to me, his eyes holding shock mixed with the wounded disbelief of a child realizing he never understood his own father. I didn't answer. I only looked at Ben. He gave a small nod, like receiving the signal he had been waiting for. All right, Ben said, standing up and picking up the remote. Maybe it's time everyone sees the full picture, not just a sentence. He clicked the button. The large screen lit up, white light washing over the ceiling and reflecting down onto the walnut table. Outside, the Union Tower hallway bustled with people, but because of the semi-transparent glass wall, anyone walking by could clearly see. A lawyer standing before a screen, 4 faces turning pale, and an older man sitting silently at the head of the table. The first slide appeared with the Sparkstone Private Bank logo and the title, Emergency Signatory Request. Case Arthur Sloane. Below it, enlarged, were the lines, Applicant, Darren Sloane, Co-applicant, Stephen Hale. I heard Marianne draw a long breath beside me while Jenna snapped toward her husband. Darren, what is this? Ben didn't let anyone rebuild their narrative. He pointed at a highlighted red box on the screen and read aloud, Reason. Applicant expresses concern for noticeable cognitive decline in the truster, suggesting inability to manage long-term financial decisions. He looked up. This is your statement to the bank, not mine, not Arthur's. Yours, Darren's, and Mr. Hale's, delivered at the teller counter. Stephen shot to his feet. That was internal consultation. We just wanted Sparkstone to be more flexible in... No, Ben said, cutting him off cleanly. He flipped to the next slide. This is Sparkstone's compliance response. The screen displayed an internal memo. Suspicion of financial exploitation. Report filed to Colorado Elder Protective Services. On the right was a bolded line. Rationale. Attempt to obtain emergency control over high-value trust assets without supporting medical documentation. Jenna covered her mouth. Odessa whispered, Elder Protective Services? Ben nodded. The bank didn't just deny it. They filed a suspicious activity report for elder abuse. Fortunately for you, they did it quietly and only sent me a copy because the client, meaning Arthur, requested it. He turned to Darren, his voice not loud but carrying through every inch of the room. You were standing very close to the criminal line without realizing it. A few employees passing by in the hallway slowed down. They couldn't hear a word, but they could see everything. A slide reading, Suspicion of Financial Exploitation, several pale faces, and the number 26,500,000 waiting to appear. Ben clicked again. The next slide appeared, the updated asset report of the Sloan Heritage Trust. In the center of the screen, filling the entire space, was the number $26,500,000. No countdown effect, no music. Just a black number on a white background, cold and absolute. And it was that starkness that made it hit like a strike to the chest. Darren opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Jenna blurted, 26,500,000. Stephen frowned as if the number offended his pride, not because he was shocked, but because he had never in his life been near a sum that large under someone else's name. Yes, Ben said, sounding like he was confirming a fact, not boasting. That is the current value of the Sloan Heritage Trust after more than 20 years of operation. That was what Darren and Mr. Hale had attempted to access through an emergency guardianship petition without any medical evidence whatsoever. And that is also the asset you have just voluntarily signed a document admitting its owner has diminished management capacity. He paused for a beat, then lowered his voice. So when I say this is money you will never touch, that is not a threat. That is a legal conclusion. I felt the gaze from the hallway spill in. A few people had stopped completely, standing a few meters from the glass, holding coffee cups, eyes fixed on the screen as if watching a scene in a movie, but happening entirely in real life. Ben switched to the final slide. On the screen now was the structural diagram of the trust. At the top was my name. Below it, a large box in the center labeled Current Primary Beneficiary, Ariana Sloan, age 8. Beneath that were smaller, fainter boxes labeled Contingent Beneficiaries, Subject to Good Faith Clause. Ben circled Ariana's box with the laser pointer, his voice no longer sharp, but deeper, heavier. The sole beneficiary of the Sloan Heritage Trust, after Arthur, is his granddaughter, Ariana Sloan. Not Darren, not Jenna, not Stephen, not anyone from the Hale family. Darren gasped. You mean the little girl? Is the only person with the legal right to receive this asset when she comes of age, provided she does not participate in any form of exploitation against her grandfather, Ben said. He moved the red dot down to the small text below, enlarging it for all to see. Any descendant who attempts to unduly influence, exploit, or diminish the dignity and living conditions of the grantor shall be removed as contingent beneficiary, effective immediately upon documented evidence. He read each word slowly, then concluded, This clause is called the Good Faith Clause. It is triggered when there is evidence that descendants attempt to push their elders out of their lives, both literally and figuratively. Jenna shook her head, her voice breaking in panic. You're saying Darren can be removed from the trust? But he's his son. Ben looked straight at her. There is no room for the word but in this structure. Arthur created the trust to protect the value he built over a lifetime, not to reward anyone who sees him as a burden to be pushed into a basement. Then he turned to me, asking for the first time in the meeting, "Arthur, would you like me to record today signatures, their attitude, and every reaction into the good faith clause file?" The whole room seemed to contract. I looked at Darren. He couldn't bring himself to look back. I looked at Jenna and saw only a mask cracking, but trying desperately to hold. I looked at Stephen and met the exact eyes of a man who understood perfectly what was happening and hated that he could not control it. I drew a long breath. "Ben," I said, my voice sounding rougher than usual, "do what you need to do." Ben nodded, turned to the screen, and switched off the projector. The light in the room changed. No longer the cold white of the slides, only the soft gold of late afternoon pouring through the glass. But I knew, after that meeting, none of them would ever see the number 26.5 million, or the name Ariana Sloan, or even their own faces, the same way again. And from now on, the battle would no longer be about who sleeps in the basement. After Ben turned off the screen with the number 26.5 million and the trust diagram, I thought the meeting had already reached the last layer of humiliation a family could endure in a single afternoon. But it turned out that was only the part about me. The part about them, the Hale family, was what Ben had been holding back like a dark lake bed, waiting for the right moment to rise. The air in room 23B was so dense that even the scrape of a chair would have sounded sharp. Darren kept his head down, Jenna clutched her bag, and Stephen wore the look of a man calculating his escape route. Odessa sat on the edge of her chair, her fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles turned white. Ben did not sit. He stood still for a moment, as if giving everyone a chance to understand the severity of what had just happened. Then he spoke slowly. "At this point, I could stop. Arthur has enough evidence to protect himself. But for you to understand why things will not go the way you scripted, we need to look at one more thing. Motive." He lifted the remote again. Darren shot up. "I don't allow you." "You allowed it a long time ago." Ben interrupted calmly. "The moment you turned your father into a pretext to walk into a bank and request control over assets that do not belong to you." He pressed the button. The screen lit up a second time. The news slide no longer had the Sparkstone logo, but a bold title, "Hale Family Financial Overview," based on public records and reports authorized for access by the client. At the bottom, small but very clear, was the line, "Data sources, County Recorder's Office, mortgage and lien records, civil court records, lawsuits, defaults, credit report, legally provided with Arthur Sloan's consent when necessary, casino, win-loss statement, issued to customers for reconciliation and tax reporting." Ben read it slowly, seemingly to ensure Stephen heard every word "public record" and authorized by the client. Then he changed the slide. A chart appeared, 3 gray bars, each one alone with its amount listed below. A red line beneath it read, "Total debt of the Hale family, $3,200,000, 3 loan files, 2 in default status." The room turned colder. "First loan," Ben pointed to the first bar, "Hale Development LLC, $1,200,000 to purchase and remodel a townhouse block in Cherry Creek, 11 months overdue, pending foreclosure." He moved the pointer to the second bar. "Second loan, Hale Media and PR, $900,000 for a branding campaign. No revenue to match. Status, default. Lender has begun seizing collateral." Darren swallowed hard. "Third loan," Ben continued, "the Lakeview Ridge home mortgage under Mr. and Mrs. Hale's name, $1,100,000. Remaining principal over $1 million, with interest and penalties. The total obligation exceeds $1,150,000. He zoomed in on the line to the right. 2 out of 3 loans are in default status. Jenna hissed, "Where did you get this? You have no right." "Mortgage debt records are public, Jenna," Ben cut her off. "Civil court is public. Liens are public. And the credit report I have because Arthur, the man you attempted to financially endanger, has the right to assess risk if his home is being cross-collateralized. If this hadn't been my family, I might have seen it as a legal lesson for people who think having money means having the right to hide everything. But this was my son, so all I felt was sorrow. Ben clicked to the next slide. A new page appeared. Jenna Hale, revolving credit card debt. $210,000. 12-month average. Spending, luxury fashion, influencer events, image expenses. Jenna snapped, "You're invading my privacy. He hid the money. They tricked us." Her scream echoed into the hallway. 2 Union Tower employees stopped to look in, while behind her the screen showed the number debt, $210,000. Ben's voice stayed flat as steel. "No one tricked you. Jenna, you owe $210,000 because you chased an influencer lifestyle. That is your choice, not Arthur's financial obligation." The next slide appeared. On it were the words, Darren Sloan, gambling activity, casino win-loss statement. Total net loss, $140,000, 24 months. Darren shot up. "That's my money. I didn't take from Dad." "I never said you took from the trust," Ben replied. "I'm stating a fact. You lost $140,000 in 2 years, with a father who has a trust worth $26,500,000, a father-in-law drowning in debt, a wife owing $210,000 in credit card debt, and together with her family, you twice attempted to gain emergency control over that money by painting your father as mentally incompetent." Ben paused. "That is called motive." Outside, there were no longer just 2 people standing. 3 or 4 people pretended to scroll their phones, but kept their eyes glued to the conference room. Jenna couldn't take it, screaming louder, "He hid $26 million! He let us struggle!" I said slowly, "I didn't make you struggle. I just didn't find the wrong life." Stephen slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! Arthur, what do you want? To smear my family?" Ben answered before I could. "No, I'm presenting motive, so when this goes to court, no one can rewrite the narrative." Odessa, silent until now, suddenly put a hand to her forehead. "Stephen, you said this was just helping the kids reorganize finances." Her voice shook, eyes glistening. Ben softened his tone. "Mrs. Hale, I will send you all loan files, liens, and the emergency guardianship petition so you can see for yourself. If you did not know about this, you have every right to protect yourself." Stephen paled. "You're tearing my family apart?" "No," Ben replied. "I am separating the innocent from the ones with intent." When we walked into the lobby, the cold air rushed in. Several people stepped aside as we passed. Jenna rushed to the valet counter. "Hale, white Range Rover, bring me the car." The valet checked the screen, then looked at Jenna. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The title is under a bank hold. We've been instructed to keep the keys until the repossession department contacts us. We cannot release the vehicle." His words echoed across the glass-lined lobby full of people. Jenna froze, then turned to Stephen. "You said everything was fine. You said all we needed was to get to the Sloans." Odessa suddenly swayed. I only saw her eyes widen before her body dropped onto the marble floor. In an ANOS, employees shouted for 911. Jenna collapsed beside her mother, but still threw a venomous look toward us, as if we were to blame. But I knew clearly, not me, not Ben, not the bank. They pushed themselves here. With debt, with greed, with their own signatures. We only stood there and let the light do the rest. The glass doors of the Union Tower lobby closed behind us, but the echo of Odessa collapsing still clung to the air, like a cold streak that stuck to the skin. The medics had just taken her out on a stretcher. Jenna was still shaking from shock and rage. Darren walked like someone who had lost direction, and Stephen, the man who always lectured others, always spoke as if he owned every room, suddenly couldn't walk fast anymore. We returned to conference room 23B because Ben wanted to finalize the meeting record. The 4 Hales followed, and then As soon as the glass door closed again, the room dropped into a kind of emptiness, so exposed it felt like air after a mask falls off. Jenna was the first to break. She slammed her bag onto the table so hard the metal hook hit the wood with a sharp crack. "You," she pointed straight at Darren, her voice broken but venomous. "You are the worst investment of my life." Darren jerked like he had just been slapped. Jenna went on, each word sharp as a blade. "I spent 3 years building an image, running PR, going to events, thinking I married someone with potential. And I ended up with a man who gambled away $140,000, can't even land a supervisor seat at my father's company, and dragged my whole family into humiliation in that conference room." Darren's face flushed, but before he could respond, Stephen slammed his hand on the table. "Shut up, Jenna," he barked, but he wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at Darren. Stephen planted both hands on the table, leaning so close to Darren that I could hear his breath. "You should have gotten the signature last month," he snarled, not noticing Ben and me standing right there. "I told you. When I sent the first file, you were supposed to force Arthur to sign the care authorization. If you had done it on time, we would have controlled the trust long ago, and we wouldn't be standing here stripped bare in front of an entire glass tower." Darren went pale, his voice shaking like a child. I couldn't. Dad. He's always lucid. I knew he wouldn't sign." "Then you should have created a situation where he had to sign," Stephen shouted, veins popping on his forehead, forgetting he was confessing in front of opposing counsel. "You think elderly people who are declared incompetent sign voluntarily? You should have known how to push them into signing." Marianne gasped. Ben placed a hand on the back of her chair as if anchoring her, but the unmasking wasn't done. Odessa, who had been brought back in once stable enough, insisting on returning because "our family is being smeared," as Jenna put it, sat back down, still dazed. She looked at Darren, then at me, her voice trembling but no longer strong enough to hold back the truth. "Arthur, don't be too harsh on the kids. Stephen's mother before, she was old, she couldn't remember much. Signing papers. Stephen signed for her all the time. No one ever made a fuss." The entire room froze. Jenna snapped around. "Mom, what did you just say?" But it was too late. Ben lifted the folder, turning pages slowly, and spoke in a voice so low it chilled the spine. "Please say that again. Mr. Stephen Hale sometimes signed on behalf of his mother?" Odessa blinked rapidly, no longer able to distinguish safety from confession. "Well, she was sick, and her eyesight was bad. Those authorization forms, Stephen did them for her quickly." Stephen nearly leapt from his chair. "Stop talking, Odessa." But Ben had heard enough. He set the folder on the table, the sound soft but final, like the period on a verdict not yet read. He spoke slowly, each word heavy as stone. "So, in addition to attacking Arthur, in addition to requesting emergency guardianship without any medical basis, in addition to signing the document admitting he had declining ability to manage assets, today you have added one more fact. You have previously signed on behalf of an elderly person without legal authorization." Jenna went ghost white. Darren opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Stephen broke into a cold sweat. Odessa held her head as if she didn't understand what she had just set loose. Ben stood still, but his gaze was sharp enough to slice through the room. He calmly closed the folder, locking it with a small click that echoed clearly through the breathless silence. Then he said the words I knew would follow the Hale family for the rest of their lives. "Everything that happened today, your words, your signatures, your reactions, will be forwarded in full to the prosecutor. And so there is no misunderstanding. This entire meeting has been recorded by Union Tower's security camera system from 3 angles, along with the internal audio recording of conference room 23B. This is not a retelling. This is evidence." No one in the room breathed for several seconds. Ben looked at me, tilting his head slightly. unless Arthur chooses another path. All four Hales turned toward me in unison. Jenna stopped crying instantly. Darren swallowed hard. Stephen straightened, but his eyes were panicked. Odessa grabbed my sleeve, trembling. Arthur, please. I looked at them, the same faces that just weeks ago walked into my home as if they were about to own it, and I realized it wasn't the 26.5 million that exposed them. It was this silence. I drew a long breath and said, I will answer. Tomorrow. The room fell like a stone into a well. The Hales understood immediately. Tonight would be the longest night of their lives. When Ben stepped outside to prepare the paperwork for tomorrow, the glass door of conference room 23B closed once more, leaving only 3 people, me, Marianne, and Darren. No more Jenna with her shrill voice. No more Stephen with his calculating stare. No more Odessa with her accidental but lethal confessions. Just father and son, and the truth standing between us like a cut neither of us could avoid. Darren was still standing there, his shoulders trembling as if he had just run through a storm. His eyes were red, his hands gripping the edge of the chair like someone about to collapse. Then suddenly, he knelt. Not the kind of kneeling to beg, the kind of kneeling from a man who has backed himself into the last corner. Dad, Darren choked, his hand on the cold stone floor. I'm sorry. Dad, I'm sorry. I did not move. Marianne couldn't get to him in time. She only lifted a hand to her mouth, as if holding back a sob. Darren bowed lower, his shoulders shaking. Dad, I didn't want to push you and Mom into the basement. I didn't want... He lifted his face, shattered like a child caught doing something wrong, but no longer knowing how to explain. Dad, I was just... ashamed. My chest tightened as if a stone had been dropped on it. Ashamed of what? Darren gave a twisted, broken laugh. Ashamed that I'm, the guy who grew up in a wooden house. Jenna's whole Boulder circle. They're all children of upper-class families. The Hales always talk about status, standard of living, lifestyle. He swallowed hard. I always felt like the country boy who married up. Marianne inhaled sharply, and I just stood there, watching my son wrestle the shame he had hidden for years. Darren continued, You know, Dad, the first years with Jenna, I forced myself. I bought nicer clothes, talked in that Boulder way, ate at places I didn't even want to eat at. I tried to fit into them, but the more I tried, his tears hit the floor, the more I saw you and Mom as burdens to the image I was trying to build. Marianne froze as if someone squeezed her heart. Darren slammed his fist onto his knee. I know saying that is cruel. I know. But when Stephen said all it took was your signature for us to stabilize, to move up a class, to stop being looked down on, I closed my eyes. Darren burst into harder sobs. I needed that trust to keep my pride, so I wouldn't look like someone not good enough for my wife. Marianne stepped forward, looking at Darren like he was a stranger. She spoke very softly, but the blow landed like a blade in the center of the room. You're not ashamed of being poor. You're ashamed of not having respect. Darren froze. Tears kept falling, but his eyes widened, as if that sentence struck exactly where he had hidden the truth from himself. Marianne continued, her voice trembling but painfully clear. Your father and I never taught you to look down on simple things. We lived in a wooden house, not because we were poor, but because it was something your father built with his own hands. We ate simple meals not because we lacked money, but because I loved warm dinners close together. She looked at Darren, eyes red but bright. You're not ashamed of lacking money. You're ashamed of lacking gratitude. Darren collapsed. No argument, no defense, just silence. The kind of silence that sounds like a building collapsing floor by floor inside someone's mind. I stepped forward, standing in front of my son. Darren! He looked up, his face streaked with tears and sweat. Dad, I have one question. I looked him straight in the eyes, not angry, not loud, just with the weight of someone who already knows the answer, but still has to ask. When you went with the Hales to the bank, when you signed the emergency guardianship papers, when you agreed to the plan to push your parents into the basement, did you think about us, even for 1 second? Darren opened his mouth. No sound came out. I did not need an answer. Silence had already spoken. I sat in the chair across from him. No posture of authority. Just a man looking at his son, whom he raised but no longer recognized. Darren, I said quietly, almost a whisper, there are 2 paths. I held up 2 fingers. 1, let the court decide. Let the prosecutors look at your signature, your words, and come to their own conclusion. Darren trembled. I lowered the 2nd finger. 2, or you spend the rest of your life trying to atone. Marianne turned to me, eyes wet but understanding. Darren seemed to collapse into his own shadow. Dad, what do I do to atone? I stood. That is for tomorrow. I turned toward the door. Tonight, you answer to yourself first. No yelling, no threats, no more humiliation, because that night, Darren faced the harshest truth of his life all on his own. The greatest betrayal is always the betrayal of the values your parents once taught you. And as I opened the door to leave, I knew tomorrow's decision would not only change my family, it would change the rest of my son's life. The real confrontation was still ahead, and Darren was nowhere near ready. The next morning, the Denver sunlight coming through the glass of Union Tower felt colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because of the decision I was about to make. Ben placed 2 envelopes in front of me. One envelope containing all the documents that could be sent straight to the district attorney's office, and the other one completely empty. Arthur, he said, his voice not pushing but heavy like metal, as soon as you sign here, the rest is on us in the court. Darren will face elder fraud, false statements, attempted asset seizure, and all the signatures from yesterday's meeting. This is real criminal prosecution. I looked at the envelope. Light, but its weight could crush a man's entire life. Darren stood on the other side of the room, eyes red from a sleepless night. Marianne sat beside me, her hand resting on my wrist, not to stop me, not to persuade me, just a soft touch to remind me that this decision would not affect only me, but her, this family, and the last pieces of memory we still had left. I asked Ben, what if I don't file it? Ben adjusted his glasses. If the victim doesn't push the case to the DA, they won't open it on their own. The elder fraud will still appear in the reporting system of Union Tower and Sparkstone Bank, but without an active complaint, they will not pursue it. He looked at me, the look of a man who knew I was about to choose the harder path. But, Ben said, enunciating each word, if you don't make him pay, he will never understand. I nodded. I stood. Give me 3 minutes with my son. Ben stepped out. Marianne also stepped into the hallway, closing the door gently behind her. Only Darren and I remained. He stood still, hands clasped so tight the knuckles turned white. I placed the envelope with the prosecution seal on the table. Darren, I said, my voice calm enough to surprise even myself, yesterday I gave you 2 paths. Here is the 3rd one. He looked up, eyes full of confusion. I continued, I will not file the documents. Darren broke into tears, but I raised my hand. Don't rush to be grateful. I haven't finished. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. This is not forgiveness. This is a sentence. A lifetime sentence. Darren swallowed, trying to stay composed, but visibly shaking. I opened the empty envelope and took out another document. Not a court form, but an agreement that Ben and I had prepared last night. If you want to avoid criminal charges, I said, placing the paper in front of him, you will live by these terms, not for a month, not for a year, for the rest of your life. Darren looked down. The first line alone drained the color from his face. 1. You will enter a rehab facility for 28 days to treat gambling addiction and behavior distortion caused by pride pressure. He didn't have time to react before I continued. 2. You cut all ties with the Hale family. No contact, no events, no instructions, no return to their ecosystem. Darren shut his eyes, a short silence stretching between us. I read the third term. You must divorce Jenna. His eyes opened, filled with pain. Dad, No negotiation. I cut him off. A marriage built on pride and class pressure isn't a marriage. It's a rope tying you to someone else's greed. I continued. 4. You will work at Mountain Pro Hardware. Darren protested. Dad, I graduated from college. Yes, I said, and you need to relearn the meaning of work. Mountain Pro is the only hardware store in Boulder still run the old way, carrying bricks, stacking lumber, cutting steel bars, mixing cement. You will work 6 extra hours a day. No title, no office, no high salary. I looked straight at him. You will work with your hands, to remember that what you once looked down on is exactly what fed this family for decades. Darren bowed his head. Then I read the final term, the heaviest and the most just. 5. You will live in the basement of Maple Ridge. Darren looked up, stunned. Dad, you want me down there? Yes, I said. You will pay rent with sweat, not money. I listed the subterms. You will repair the entire south porch. It has leaked for 3 seasons. You will mow the lawn twice a week. You will re-insulate the attic before winter. You will help me rebuild the back staircase by the pine grove. I looked at him. You were ready to push me into the basement. Now you will live there, to learn that the basement is not a place to discard people, but a place to rebuild yourself. Darren cried, but he did not resist. He understood. This was the most merciful sentence he could receive. I placed the pen in front of him. Darren Sloan, I said slowly, either you sign, or I hand everything to the DA right now. The room compressed. The entire world narrowed to the breath of a man standing at the crossroads of his life. Darren picked up the pen. His hand shook so hard the tip scraped a small mark on the paper. But then he signed with the hands of someone who had lost everything, but had just received a chance to start over. When Darren finished signing, I knew the road ahead would not be easy, but at least it would be his own road, no longer owned by the Hale family, no longer built on anyone else's illusions. The rhythm of justice had entered a new chapter. Rumors travel faster than any wind that has ever swept across the slopes of Boulder. The next morning, while Marianne and I were still drinking our first cups of coffee at Maple Ridge, my phone vibrated nonstop. It wasn't Ben, it wasn't Mountain Pro, it wasn't Darren. It was notifications from dozens of acquaintances. Arthur, have you seen Jenna's live stream? Jenna, the woman who once stood at my doorstep demanding the master suite, who said it was reasonable for me to sleep in the basement, who called herself the one who elevated Darren, was now sobbing on camera like a bad actress. The live stream opened with her makeup smeared, mascara streaking into 2 black lines like the borders of a fallen empire. Her voice was shrill but trembling in a controlled way. Everyone, I was betrayed. My husband's family ruined me. She choked up, then brushed her hair back, trying to regain the polished influencer image. My father-in-law, Arthur Sloan, lied to us. He hid tens of millions. He trapped our family. I'm the victim. But what Jenna didn't anticipate was that the internet is not the Hale living room, where all she had to do was frown and everyone rushed to take her side. The live stream had barely run for 60 seconds when the comments exploded. Not sympathy, not pity, but anger, mockery, and the unfiltered truth spoken without restraint. A highlighted comment kept appearing. Gold digger exposed. You've been unmasked, gold digger. Girl, money doesn't love you back. Thought you married rich. Turns out you married a walking dead. You crying for love or for that 26 million trust? Jenna read the comments and her face turned chalk white. She tried to scream over them. No, you don't understand. My husband's family hid money. They made us struggle. I'm the one who was mistreated, but the internet didn't spare her. Struggle where, sis? Your IG is all resorts. 210,000 in credit card debt, and you call yourself a victim? Boulder doesn't need another bad actress. And then someone, no one knows who, an anonymous account posted a screen-recorded clip from the Union Tower cameras. The moment Jenna screamed in the conference room, "You are the worst investment of my life," and Stephen shouting, "You should have gotten the signature last month," and Odessa slipping, "Signing papers. Stephen signed for his mother all the time." Just a few seconds, but enough to destroy the Hale family's entire public image in Boulder. Jenna practically shrieked, "Stop posting that clip." But the internet never stops for the begging of someone whose true face is moments from exposure. At the same time, messages from Ben poured in. I opened them. "Arthur, the SEC has launched a preliminary review. Not yet a formal investigation, but enough to freeze 2 major accounts under Stephen. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, an agency that does not play games with anyone involved in asset manipulation." Ben explained, "It's only the opening step, but it's enough to freeze 2 major accounts and pull Stephen under monitoring." I closed my eyes. The man who once slammed his hand on my table, demanding to remodel my house, was now being slowly broken by the very lies he had pushed himself into. Before I could breathe, Ben sent another message. "Odessa is being sued by her own mother. Pueblo County Court just accepted the petition for unauthorized withdrawal." In it, the elderly woman also stated that Stephen had signed financial papers on her behalf. I froze. "For what?" Ben replied, "Unauthorized withdrawal. Pueblo County Court has accepted the filing. It includes details of Stephen signing in place of his mother." I braced myself against the kitchen counter, feeling as if this house, the house they tried to seize, was breathing deeper than usual, as though it was witnessing justice gently, returning to where it belonged. Marianne looked at me. "Arthur, is this what you wanted?" I shook my head. "No, but it's what they sowed." We sat on the long bench facing the window, looking out at the pine forest, swaying lightly in the wind. Darren was still in the 28-day rehab. I hadn't told him anything about the Hale family. He needed to focus on himself first, not the storms created by those who once controlled him. But the storm outside didn't stop. By the end of the day, Jenna's live stream had reached nearly 1 million views, becoming the top video in Colorado within 8 hours. Local news ran headlines. "Hale family scandal erupts. Influencer claims she was deceived, but evidence shows the opposite." Financial analysis articles began tracing the origins of the Hale family's debts. Marriage blogs discussed toxic relationships and class-based vanity. And a 2-minute compilation video from a channel specializing in analyzing drama was filled with unforgettable comments. "This is why you don't flaunt lifestyle without real money. No respect for in-laws, then a public downfall is deserved. The Union Tower conference room clip is peak mask drop. Jenna lost control. Stephen lost his reputation. Odessa was sued, and all of Boulder, all of Colorado, saw the truth they had tried to hide behind fancy dinners and glittering social media. Jenna's video kept going viral. But this time, every frame of it had become social evidence, exposing the entire Hale family on a scale they had never imagined. Colorado would never look at them the same way again, and the story was far from over. When the storm named the Hale family finally settled, Maple Ridge seemed to breathe again after a winter longer than any other. The air along the mountain slope felt clearer, the pine scent stronger, and the morning light had a gentleness, as if the house had reclaimed the soul that always belonged to it. But the clearest change was not in the scenery. It was in the people who walked through its door. Ariana arrived on a Friday afternoon, wearing a backpack and carrying a stack of school books and papers, just a child coming home from class, exhausted after months of watching the adults in her family move in and out of arguments and humiliating live streams. I came back to help you, she said, her voice small but steady. The kind of voice a child has when she is forced to grow up early because she was dragged into a battle that was never hers. Marianne lit up almost instantly. She laid out extra blankets, cooked the soup Ariana had liked since she was little, arranged a study corner for her near the window, as if the house had just been given a new light. Maple Ridge became a real home again. No more comments about a classy master suite. No more breath of people who believed they had the right to remodel someone else's life. Only the sound of warm wood, the kettle humming softly, Ariana asking her grandmother about homework, and Marianne's laughter. A sound I thought I would never hear again. And Darren. He still lived here, but not on the second floor, not near the living room, in the basement, the place he once wanted to send me. He went down there voluntarily as part of the life sentence agreement he signed. That morning, it rained. Not a violent rain, but the kind that dripped endlessly like old code repeating itself for a lifetime. I stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of metal tapping the roof. Tap, clink, tap, repeating, steady, like the heartbeat of someone trying to make amends. Darren was fixing the roof, the very section he once said should be torn out to make a Scandinavian bathroom. He wore a cheap rubber hat, a shirt soaked with rainwater, holding a mallet, standing on a ladder, looking nothing like the man who once called this house too plain. No more white dress shirt slicked with gel, no more half-smile when mentioning the Hale family lifestyle standards. Only a battered, drenched man trying to repair what he himself had damaged. Marianne passed by, about to open the door to call him in, but I placed my hand on her shoulder. "Let him," I whispered. "Let him work." Some apologies must be spoken in sweat. Some fractures only mend when the person who caused them sands each grain of wood by hand. I stood behind the large glass pane, watching Darren for a long time. He didn't know I was there. He didn't turn around. But I could see the change in every hammer strike. No more pride, no more desire to be praised, no more trying to impress anyone. Only real labor and real silence. I didn't open the door. I didn't call him in. I didn't praise him, and I didn't scold him. Because some sentences don't need a court, only a father seeing his son clearly. Evening fell and the rain stayed. I went up to the third floor to grab a coil of lights. When I opened the storage room, I saw a notebook placed neatly on top of the toolbox. No note, no letter, no message. Only a line written in pencil at the top, left of the first page. The day I rebuild my life. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the page. Not instant forgiveness, not forgetting. But it was the first time in weeks that I felt the basement beneath my feet, where Darren was sleeping, working, and atoning, was no longer the place someone is pushed into. It was where a man was slowly learning how to stand upright, on his own legs. I closed the notebook. Under Maple Ridge's warm yellow light, I knew a new chapter for the Sloan family was opening. But where that chapter would go still depended on what Darren did after that first written line. Autumn arrived in Maple Ridge in its own way, not hurried, not loud, just gently laying golden, honey-colored streaks of sunlight across the wooden porch. The wind moved through the pine forest, creating the sound I always joked with Marianne was the mountain's string instrument, a sound that was never harsh, but always awakened. Things people thought they had buried deep. I stood on the porch, the place that once witnessed the day my own son wanted to push me into the basement, and also the place where I watched him fix the roof in the rain like a man rewriting his life. From winter to summer and into this autumn, Maple Ridge had changed completely. But more importantly, the people in this house had changed. Darren still lived in the basement, still woke at 6 in the morning, still did manual work for Mountain Pro Hardware, still repaired each wooden plank and each insulation strip like someone gathering the pieces of dignity he had broken himself. Not a forced agreement, a choice. For the first time in years, I saw in his eyes no more struggle to prove something to others, but a desire to become someone who could look himself in the mirror. Marianne revived in the way only women who have lived through family pain can understand. She tended the yard, cooked, brewed evening tea for Ariana, and every time I walked into the living room, I saw the afternoon light from the window reflecting on her hair, like someone stepping out of her own youth. And Ariana, the child the Hale family never valued, was now the calmest part of the house. She studied at the wooden table near the window, made cocoa for everyone at night, and spent weekends walking into the forest to take biology notes. Every time she smiled, the house brightened in the literal sense, a kind of soft, clear light that carried none of the fake shadows of the aesthetic photos Jenna once obsessed over. In the documents of the Sloan Heritage Trust, the beneficiary section had been updated. No Darren, no Jenna. Only one line, Ariana Sloan, primary beneficiary. Ben handled everything carefully, fully notarized, filed the documents into Sparkstone's vault, and sent me scans as a reminder that everything had finally returned to where it belonged. One afternoon, after watching Darren sand the porch railing, I gently closed the front gate. A strong wind blew from the pine forest, carrying the scent of raw pine resin, a smell I always considered the smell of truth. I stood there for a long time, looking at the forest that had witnessed everything: love, betrayal, greed, remorse, and the moment people who once walked wrong were learning to walk right again. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger only makes the mind heavy, like wet concrete. I saw only one thing clearer than any light I had ever measured in bridge inspection work. Justice is not an explosion, not a shout, not an act of revenge. Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs light strong enough to expose the face of darkness. And that was the end. Not the end of the Sloan family, just the end of a chapter full of shadows, to begin a new one, brighter and truer, a chapter I hoped would never again need lawyers, traps, or painful signatures, only light and silence clear enough for each person to look at themselves. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. Not everyone has the patience to move through the darkest chapters of a family and stay until the moment light appears. Soft, but real. If my story made you think about something in your own life, a fracture, a sadness, or a hope you haven't dared to name, then this journey is no longer mine alone. It touched you, and that means more to me than you know. We cannot choose the family we are born into, but we can choose how we stand when pushed down, and choose light instead of darkness, even when no one believes you, even when you have only yourself left. And if you believe justice can arrive in silence but with certainty, if you believe honesty always outlasts glamour, if you believe everyone deserves to stand in their own light, leave a single dot in the comments and tell me where you're reading from. Just one dot, enough for me to know that out there are still people who, like me, refuse to give up. Thank you, truly.